This is a giant chunk of blue glass, and in this video, I'm going to chip it into a knife. The first step is to break as many large pieces off as possible. This way, I can make it thinner and more two-dimensional, just like a knife blade is. This glass is also beautiful, so all the chips that are coming off I'll save and use them for making jewelry or other arrowheads and knife blades. The more thin and more refined this piece becomes, the easier it is to break in half, so I'm using very precise and small tools. As you can see, we're getting closer to the knife blade shape. To shape and sharpen the blade, I am using a small antler tool to push flakes off of the edge. Now I have to create a tang in the blade so it'll fit securely to our handle. Here is the finished blue glass blade, and here is the finished knife. This knife is super sharp and beautiful, but I wouldn't use it in the kitchen. I want to turn this rock into an obsidian harpoon spearhead, but to do so I have to expose the interior first. To skin the stone, I'm using a deer antler to strike pieces off and remove the exterior. In my opinion, there's nothing more satisfying than breaking off the outside of the stone and exposing the glassy interior. Each time I strike a piece off, it becomes more refined and more like a spearhead. As you can see, we have a long ways to go. Now that the spearhead is becoming more refined, I'm using a deer antler with a sharp tip to press pieces off of the edge and shape it. Because this is going to be a harpoon spearhead, I'm creating sets of sharp barbs along the blade's edge. The last step on this piece is to sharpen up the tip as well as the barbs, and now the obsidian harpoon spearhead is complete. In this video, I'm going to make an obsidian knife for my friend because he wants to use it to fillet a fish. This big piece I broke off will be perfect for our blade. To get started on the blade, I use a moose antler to break off big pieces, thin it down, and also shape it. I make sure to strike the obsidian in the right areas with the correct amount of force, otherwise I could risk breaking it in half. And while I don't usually wear gloves in my videos, I'm wearing one in this one because this stone was so big. It's also important that I'm protecting my leg with leather pads during this process. We're getting closer to the finished blade, so now I'm using smaller tools to sharpen and shape the blade further. To finish the blade, I use deer antler to sharpen it, as well as create the tang for it to fit properly in our antler handle. The tang in the blade also allows me to wrap it securely to the handle with deer sinew. I made sure to make this knife thin and really sharp, so it'll work well to fillet a fish. In this video, I'll be chipping this large chunk of beautiful red obsidian into a dagger. To reduce the mass of the stone and make it more like a blade, I'm using a large moose antler to chip pieces off and make it thinner. Red obsidian is more rare than the typical black variety, and it gets this color from iron oxide that was trapped in the lava when it cooled. As we chip the stone, it becomes more refined and more like a blade. The more refined it becomes, the smaller tools I use to make sure that I don't break it. The final edge work is done with a smaller antler tool, and now it's time to create the tang in the blade so it will fit securely to our dagger handle. To secure the blade to the handle, I'm using pine sap glue and then soaking some rawhide and wrapping it securely. The rawhide has now dried and tightened, and the dagger is complete. I love the colors in this material. Every time I make something out of obsidian, people always ask if I can make a nether portal, so that's what I'm going to do in this video. When I was mining this obsidian, I made sure to select pieces that are chunky and already cube-like. After hours of chipping these cobbles of obsidian into cubes, I now have enough cubes to make the nether portal. The glue that will hold this portal together is made from pine sap and charcoal dust. When planning this project, I had many doubts. For example, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make obsidian cubes, and I wasn't sure if the glue was going to hold them together. In the end, it all worked out, and the portal came together beautifully. The last step is to light the portal with flint and steel. The real obsidian nether portal is now complete. In this video, I'm going to take this giant chunk of obsidian and turn it into a full tang knife. Because this is a large, irregular chunk, I have to make sure that I strike it in the right areas to remove the mass that I don't want. The antler of an elk is perfect for this task because elk are large animals and grow huge antlers. The blade and the handle of this knife are going to be made from the same piece of obsidian, so I have to start carving out where I want my blade and handle to be. I also shape the hard-to-reach areas of the handle with a small antler punch. I also use a fine antler tool to shape the handle and create serrations on the edge. I smooth out the handle for a comfortable fit in the hand, and now the knife is complete. This black obsidian reflects the light really well, and the finished knife feels great in my hand. Obsidian ninja stars are something that I wanted to make for a long time now, so in this video I'm going to be chipping a ninja star out of obsidian and testing them out. Obsidian is perfect for this because it's one of the sharpest materials on earth, and it can also be chipped into the shape that I want. Now that the cobble that I started out with is thinner, I make it into a disc shape with an antler tool and then start to shape it into the throwing star. I use a smaller, more fine antler tool to make the points of the ninja star and then sharpen them up with the same tool. I made a small group of these and it's time to test them out.
Yo!
As you can see, I was really impressed by how well these ninja stars work, especially the saw blade one. They were even able to penetrate the hard skin of a pumpkin. This beautiful material is called opalite, and in this video, I'll be chipping a spearhead from it. To chip this large chunk to the appropriate shape and thickness, I used antlers and stones. This big elk antler I'm using is perfect for this task because it allows me to remove large pieces by striking the right areas. The chunk is now getting closer to a spearhead shape, so I use smaller deer antler tools to chip finer pieces off. Now that the spearhead is refined enough, I use a small deer antler tip to press flakes off of the edge and shape the tip. I then use a narrow bone tool to chip out 2 notches and then sharpen the edge with serrations. The opalite spearhead is now complete, and it's very sharp. I love the way this material looks at certain angles in the sun. Rainbow obsidian makes a beautiful spearhead. In this video, I'm going to chip this chunk of rainbow obsidian into a spearhead. Rainbow obsidian gets its color from microscopic minerals and bubbles that were trapped inside of it when it was lava. This causes the obsidian to reflect a different color other than black, and in this case, this piece was entirely green. To break the obsidian and refine the spearhead, I am using a small piece of deer antler to chip pieces off of the edge. When the spearhead is almost done, I use a smaller tool made from deer antler to push flakes off of the edge. Next, I use a buffalo bone to chip the notches into the bottom of the spearhead. These notches will help the binding secure the spearhead to the spear shaft. With the same tool, I also chip out small serrations on the edge to make it sharper. The finished spearhead is now complete and shines a beautiful vibrant green color in the light. When I saw this giant chunk of blue glass for sale, I had to buy it because I knew it was going to make a beautiful spearhead. The first thing I did was try to knock off as many large chunks of glass that I can use for future projects, such as making arrowheads. This blue glass looks like sapphire or even Arctic ice. The more pieces I break off, the less chunky and more like a spearhead this piece of glass becomes. After removing many more chips, the spearhead is starting to take shape, and at this point, I use a deer antler to break off smaller pieces. I also use deer antler tips to press off flakes and shape the tip. The next step is to create the notches down towards the base of the spearhead. These will help secure the spearhead to a spear shaft. I also chip out a small concavity on the base to make it more aesthetic. The very last step on the spearhead is to create small serrations that are basically like tiny teeth. The spearhead is now complete, and I love the way blue glass looks. Red obsidian is a less common variety of obsidian that gets its reddish color when iron-rich lava cools quickly. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you how I make a red obsidian arrowhead. The first step is to reduce the small cobble of obsidian and expose the beautiful interior. A fractured blade of obsidian has an edge that is 16 times sharper than a surgeon's steel scalpel. I use both stone and antler tools to chip the obsidian into a triangular shape. As the arrowhead becomes more refined, I use finer pointed antler tools to shape the arrowhead. Now that we have the appropriate arrowhead shape, it's time to add the notches so it can be wrapped securely to an arrow shaft. Now that I've chipped out the notches, the final step is to sharpen up the edge by chipping out serrations. Fracturing the edge and making serrations makes the arrowhead very sharp and deadly. The arrowhead is complete, and here it is next to a twin made from black obsidian so you can see the color difference. Let's make an obsidian spear. I first start out by breaking the piece of obsidian with antler or a round stone. Each time I break the obsidian, it becomes flatter and more two-dimensional. I am also keeping shape in mind, and I am making sure that we are working towards a triangular shape. It's time to use the other end of the tool that I was using to strike pieces off to press pieces off of the edge. With the shape complete, it's time to add notches to the base of the spearhead so it can be wrapped securely to the spear shaft. The last step is to sharpen the spearhead before we secure it to the spear shaft. I heat up a glue made from pine sap and charcoal dust, which acts as a hot melt glue. With the glue still hot, I secure our spearhead into the spear shaft and let it cool. Once the glue has hardened, I wrap the obsidian spearhead with deer sinew. Now that the sinew binding has dried and tightened, the spear is complete. Obsidian has been used to make weapons for thousands of years, and in this video, I'm going to be making an obsidian karambit. The first step is to flatten out the piece of obsidian by striking the edge precisely. Also, these obsidian pieces are very sharp, and that's why obsidian has been used for making weapons and hunting tools. As our blade starts to become more refined, I switch to using smaller deer antler tools to strike pieces off of the edge. I also use a small antler tip to do the final work. Now that we have the right blade shape, it's time to make the serrations. To make the serrations, I chip small indentations along the edge. The blade is complete, and now it's time to put it into our handle. I first glue the blade in with a hot melt glue made from pine sap and charcoal dust. Once this glue has cooled, it hardens, and now it's time to wrap the blade with sinew. Once the sinew dries, it tightens and secures the blade to the handle. Here is the finished obsidian karambit.
These are obsidian blades, and they are one of the sharpest objects on Earth. I created these blades by striking a piece of obsidian with another stone.
Let's cut some stuff with obsidian.
Look how easily the obsidian slices through the tomato. I also wanted to get some really thin slices, and it had no problem doing that.
One of the disadvantages of an obsidian blade is that it's usually not that straight, so it's harder to get super thin cuts. This piece that I have right here, I was able to get a really thin slice of the banana regardless.
One of the blades I had looked like a claw, and I wanted to see how well it would cut through paper, and it did really well. Then sliced and diced a grape with the obsidian blade, and it seemed to cut through really easily, and the skin didn't get damaged in the cuts. I think it would be really interesting to look at these cuts underneath a microscope. Let's use the obsidian to cut some tough leather. After all this cutting, our blade took very little damage. This chunk of obsidian was the perfect size to craft into an obsidian spearhead. The more pieces I strike off of the obsidian core, the more it looks like a spearhead. I use smaller tools like a deer antler to strike pieces off. With each blow, the obsidian spearhead becomes flatter and more triangular. Supporting and striking the stone on my leg provides me with great accuracy. Many stone tools from prehistory had notches in them so that they could be tied or wrapped to a handle or spear shaft. To chip out the notches, I'm using a thin buffalo bone called an ulna. Now that the notches have been put in the base of the spearhead, it's time to sharpen up the edge with some serrations. And they make the blade's edge very sharp. What was once a stone in the ground is now an obsidian spearhead. And because obsidian is volcanic glass, it sometimes is translucent like man-made glass is. As the edges of obsidian are as sharp or sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. Many of these large chunks that I am knocking off will be further refined and chipped into spearheads and smaller arrowheads. As the obsidian piece becomes more refined, I use an elk antler to strike large pieces off and make it thinner. I wanted to test to see if this piece of wood would break obsidian, and sure enough, it did. I used it to shape the edge and also switched back to using a stone. As it becomes closer to the finished spearhead shape, I use a deer antler to strike smaller pieces off. When it is thin enough, I switch to using a small tool called a pressure flaker made out of antler to press flakes off of the edge and make serrations. I then create small indentations towards the base of the spearhead. These will become my notches. Here is the finished spearhead, and these are all the pieces of obsidian that I knocked off the large chunk. This particular obsidian is very pure and I can see straight through it. In this video, I'm going to chip this beautiful piece of obsidian into a Stone Age dagger. Many of these large pieces that I am removing will not be waste, as I can use them to make smaller arrowheads and knife blades. Because the blade of a dagger is flat, I am removing as much material from the surface as possible and making the piece of obsidian more flat. I chip out the handle with a rough-shaped stone and do much more work to refine the dagger. The fine shaping on the handle and the blade are done with a small deer antler tine. Now that we have the dagger finished, it's time to wrap the handle with deerskin to make it more comfortable in the hand. I then use one of these obsidian blades to cut a buckskin strap. I carefully wrap the handle of the obsidian dagger and then cut off the excess buckskin with an obsidian flake. I am really happy with the finished product and the way that the wrapped leather handle feels in my hand.